It all started on what seemed like a perfectly normal flight. I had checked in early, picked my favorite seat by the window, and was looking forward to a peaceful journey. The clouds outside promised a calm, scenic trip, and I was ready to dive into my book and lose myself in its pages. Little did I know, my quiet flight was about to turn into a lesson in patience, composure, and standing your ground. As I settled comfortably into my window seat, arranging my small bag under the seat in front of me, I noticed the aisle slowly filling with passengers. The usual sounds of rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the occasional flight attendant's call filled the cabin. Everything was ordinary, until she appeared. She was a middle-aged woman, perfectly coiffed hair, sharp sunglasses even inside the plane, and a scowl that could rival a thunderstorm. From the moment she stepped into the aisle, the energy in the cabin shifted. You could almost feel the tension radiating off her. She was a classic Karen, the type you read about in memes, the type who believes the world exists solely to cater to her whims. And now, she had set her sights on my window seat. "Excuse me," she barked, cutting through the low hum of passenger chatter. I looked up, slightly startled, but smiled politely. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, this is my seat," she snapped, thrusting her boarding pass toward me. I took it, glanced at the seat number, and then back at her. Sure enough, the boarding pass clearly showed her seat several rows away from mine. "I'm afraid this is actually my seat," I said calmly, pointing to the number on my boarding pass. "No, no, no," she said, waving her hand in disbelief. "I always sit by the window. You need to move." At that moment, other passengers began to notice. Some rolled their eyes, others quietly whispered among themselves. A few pulled out their phones, ready to capture the confrontation. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to touch. I stayed seated, maintaining a calm, collected demeanor. My heart was racing a bit, I won't lie, but I knew panicking or arguing aggressively would only make things worse. I had seen countless videos of Karen incidents on the internet, and I was determined not to become a viral example of a bad reaction. "Ma'am," I said, my voice steady, "I understand you prefer the window seat, but my boarding pass clearly shows that I am assigned to this seat. I'm happy to check with the flight attendant if there's any confusion." Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't care what your boarding pass says. I want that window seat, and I'm telling you to move." At this point, I could see the flight attendants approaching, their expressions a mix of concern and preparedness. It was clear she had made enough of a scene to warrant intervention. But instead of letting them handle it immediately, she decided to escalate the situation. "You people just don't understand," she yelled at the nearby passengers, turning her outrage toward anyone within earshot. "I always sit here. I've been on this flight 100 times, and this is my seat." I let out a small, amused sigh. She clearly believed that history and habit outweighed actual rules and logic. I glanced around the cabin, noticing the smirks on a few passengers' faces, and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and amusement. It was almost theatrical, the way she flailed, demanding what wasn't hers. Finally, one of the flight attendants reached my row. She looked at the boarding passes, then back at Karen, and spoke with calm authority. "Ma'am, your seat is actually in row 12, aisle. The window seat in this row belongs to this passenger," she said, gesturing to me. Karen's jaw dropped, her face turning a shade of red that almost matched the flight attendant's uniform. She sputtered, trying to argue, but the evidence was clear, and the flight attendant's tone left no room for debate. Slowly, she huffed and stomped down the aisle toward her actual seat, muttering under her breath. As she disappeared from view, I finally leaned back, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The rest of the passengers returned to their own seats, and the hum of conversation slowly resumed. I opened my book, though I couldn't help but glance out the window every few seconds, savoring the peaceful clouds and the victory of standing firm. That moment, simple as it may seem, was a powerful reminder. Sometimes, people will demand what isn't theirs, will try to intimidate you with anger and entitlement, and will even make a scene in public to get their way. But staying calm, knowing your rights, and letting reason and evidence do the talking can be far more effective than shouting or escalating. The flight continued without further incident. Karen spent most of the journey quietly sulking in her own seat, occasionally glancing toward me, no doubt still frustrated that her dramatic display hadn't worked. Meanwhile, I enjoyed my view of the endless sky, grateful for the small lesson in patience, composure, and silent triumph. By the time we landed, The story had already begun circulating quietly among the passengers, muted laughter, shared smiles, and knowing glances. No words had needed to be said to make the point clear. Sometimes, a quiet stance and proper documentation are all it takes to teach a lesson someone will never forget. And as I stepped off the plane, I couldn't help but think, the window seat was more than just a seat, it was a small victory for fairness, reason, and common sense in a world that sometimes forgets both. The moment I boarded the plane, I felt relieved that the trip was finally happening. I had chosen my seat carefully, the window seat, 18A, because watching the sky always calmed my nerves. I placed my backpack under the seat, fastened my belt, and waited for the rest of the passengers to settle in. But peace didn't last long. A woman with an overstuffed handbag and an attitude you could feel from 10 feet away marched down the aisle. Her sunglasses were still on, even inside the plane, and her lips were pressed together like she was already disappointed in everyone. She stopped at my row and snapped, "You're in my seat." I stayed calm. "This is 18A, the window seat. My boarding pass." She shoved her own ticket in front of my face. "Seat 18C, aisle." "Still," she declared, "I don't sit in aisle seats. I need the window. So move." Her voice was loud enough that half the row turned to look. I replied politely, "Ma'am, this is my assigned seat." She crossed her arms. "I don't care about assigned seats. I get motion sickness. You're young, you'll be fine in the aisle." Her sense of entitlement was astonishing. Before I could answer, she waved down a flight attendant, loudly complaining that I had stolen her seat. The attendant checked both passes, then calmly said, "Ma'am, he is in the correct seat. You must sit in 18C. Karen huffed dramatically and dropped into the aisle seat, muttering insults under her breath, disrespectful, selfish, unbelievable. I ignored her and looked out the window. But as the plane leveled in the air, I remembered something I'd noticed earlier. Row 19 had an empty window seat. I pressed the call button. "Is seat 19A available?" The flight attendant smiled. "Yes, you can move." I stood up, grabbed my bag, and said just loud enough for Karen, "I'm shifting to another window seat. You can have this one now." Her eyes lit up with victory, until she sat down. The window was misaligned, giving almost no view. A crying baby sat beside her. And the man on the other side coughed every few minutes. Meanwhile, my new seat was peaceful, perfect, and quiet. Karen didn't say a word for the rest of the flight. She got the seat she demanded. Just not the seat she wanted. And that was the lesson she never forgot.